The day I inherited my Aunt Helen's law practice, my husband's family didn't even try to hide their disappointment. A small-town law office in Millbrook, population 3,247, was hardly the glamorous inheritance they'd been expecting from my eccentric aunt who never married but somehow always seemed to have money. A law office? Victoria Peters examined the dusty waiting room with the same expression she'd use for a gas station bathroom. Rachel, darling, you can't seriously be considering keeping this place. I ran my hand along my aunt's solid oak desk, remembering countless afternoons spent here as a child, watching her work with an intensity that made even hardened corporate lawyers nervous. Actually, I am. Aunt Helen built something special here. Special? My husband James snorted, adjusting his designer tie. It's a dump in the middle of nowhere. The furniture alone is probably older than both of us combined. He wasn't wrong about the furniture's age. Every piece in Helen's office had history. The Victorian desk, the leather chairs, the massive bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. Even the oil painting of the town's founding father that hung behind her desk had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Helen was. Victoria paused, searching for a diplomatic word. Unique. But surely she left you something more than this. Investment accounts, property? That woman always had money, even as she lived like this. She gestured vaguely at the modest office. I thought about the letter Helen had left with her will, written in her precise handwriting. My dearest Rachel, what I'm leaving you isn't just a law practice, it's a legacy of justice. Look carefully, dear. The truth isn't always where people expect to find it. The practice is profitable, I said, opening one of the recent ledgers. And it serves an important role in the community. Community? James laughed. Rachel, you went to Harvard Law. You were on track to make partner at Goldman & Pierce. This isn't a career move, it's career suicide. I closed the ledger carefully. James had never understood why I'd left corporate law, even before Aunt Helen's death. The 60-hour weeks, the cutthroat politics, the moral compromises, it had been slowly killing my soul. I've made my decision, I said quietly but firmly. I'm keeping the practice. Victoria exchanged a look with James that spoke volumes. They'd never approved of me, the scholarship kid who'd somehow snagged their precious son. My success at Goldman & Pierce had been their only consolation, proof that I could at least contribute to the family's prestige. Well, Victoria sighed dramatically, when this little adventure fails, don't expect us to help. James needs a wife who understands ambition, not small-town charity cases. After they left, I sat in Helen's chair, my chair now, and looked around the office. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, catching dust motes in its beams. The whole room smelled of leather, old books, and furniture polish. My phone buzzed. A text from James. Be reasonable. Sell the practice. Come back to the city. Last chance. I turned off the phone and pulled out Helen's letter again. Something about her words nagged at me. Look carefully. What was I supposed to be looking for? The next few days were a crash course in small-town law. Helen's practice wasn't just about contracts and wills, it was about people. Her filing system was meticulous, every case documented with notes that went beyond legal details to include personal observations, family histories, connections that spanned generations. Your aunt was a guardian angel, Mrs. Rodriguez told me when she came in to discuss her late husband's estate. She protected people, kept their secrets safe. Secrets. That word kept coming up as I met with clients. Everyone in Millbrook seemed to have them, and somehow, Helen had been their keeper. It was during my second week, late one evening as I was organizing files, that I noticed something odd about the founding father's portrait. The frame hung slightly askew, and the wall behind it seemed different. Heart-pounding, I carefully lifted the heavy painting. Behind it was a safe, not a modern one, but an antique model that looked original to the building. Beside it was a small envelope with my name on it in Helen's handwriting. Dear Rachel, the note read, if you're reading this, you've started to see what others missed. The combination is the date you first told me you wanted to be a lawyer, the day you learned what justice really means. I closed my eyes, remembering. I was 12, spending the summer with Helen while my parents worked. A local farmer had come in, desperate because a big agriculture company was trying to force him off his land. I watched Helen work through the night, digging through old records until she found the document that saved his family's farm. With trembling fingers, I dialed the combination. 07 to 1598. The safe door swung open with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. Inside were stacks of folders, each labeled meticulously in Helen's handwriting. As I began to read, my hands started shaking. This wasn't just case files. This was dynamite. Each folder contained evidence, systematic corruption involving some of the most powerful families in the state. Land grabs, environmental violations, tax fraud, all documented with Helen's precise attention to detail. And the names involved, including my in-laws, the Peters family. My phone buzzed again. James calling this time. I let it go to voicemail as I continued reading. The story unfolding in these files was incredible. For decades, Helen had been gathering evidence, building a case that could bring down an entire network of corruption. But why hadn't she used it? The answer lay in the final folder, labeled simply, "When ready." My dearest Rachel, Helen's letter began. I couldn't act on this information in my lifetime. The people involved were too powerful, too entrenched. But you have something I never had. You know their world from the inside. You understand how they think, how they operate. And most importantly, you have the courage to do what's right, no matter the cost. I sat back in Helen's chair, my mind racing. The Peters family's real estate empire. Their mysterious ability to always get the right permits, the sudden reasoning that always worked in their favor. It all made sense now. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Victoria. Dinner tomorrow night. Non-negotiable. Time to discuss your future. I smiled, gathering the files carefully. Oh, we discussed the future all right, just not the one they had in mind. Tomorrow night, the Peters family would learn that some inheritances are worth more than money. Some are worth their weight in justice. And Aunt Helen, it seemed, had been playing a very long game indeed. The Peters family mansion was exactly what you'd expect from one of the state's most prestigious real estate developers. A sprawling Georgian estate with manicured gardens and a 3-car garage that probably cost more than my aunt's entire law office. I adjusted my simple black dress, the one Victoria had once dismissed as outlet quality, and checked my briefcase one last time. Helen's files were organized chronologically, each piece of evidence ready to be revealed at precisely the right moment. Rachel, darling. Victoria's voice carried across the marble foyer. So glad you could join us. James was worried you might be too busy with your small-town concerns. I smiled, accepting her air kiss. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Good evening, Rachel. Charles Peters, my father-in-law, barely looked up from his Wall Street Journal. I trust you've come to your senses about that law practice. Actually, I said, setting my briefcase beside my chair, that's what I wanted to discuss tonight. The dining room could have hosted a state dinner. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the mahogany table, while uniformed staff served what was probably a $1,000 bottle of wine. I've been going through Aunt Helen's files. I began watching Victoria's face carefully, found some fascinating cases, including quite a few involving Peter's development. Charles lowered his paper slightly. Helen Morgan handled some minor zoning issues for us years ago. Nothing significant. Minor? I took a sip of wine. Like the Henderson Farm rezoning in 1992, or the Riverside Environmental Impact Study in 2005. The subtle tightening around Victoria's eyes told me everything. She knew exactly what I was talking about. Ancient history, Charles wigged dismissively. Routine business matters. Routine? I opened my briefcase, extracting the first file. Like bribing county officials to change floodplain designations, or burying environmental reports showing toxic contamination. The crystal glass in Victoria's hand trembled slightly. I don't know what you think you found, but I found everything, Victoria. I laid out Helen's files one by one. 30 years of corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy, all documented with my aunt's remarkable attention to detail. James, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. Rachel, whatever you think you have. What I have, I cut him off, is enough evidence to send half the Peters family to prison, including proof that you knew about the asbestos in those low-income housing units you developed last year. Charles's face had gone from red to white. Now see here. No, you see. I stood, my voice carrying in the suddenly silent room. For decades, you've been building your empire by destroying people's lives, Small farmers, working families, elderly retirees, anyone who stood in your way. Those people were compensated, Victoria said weakly. Compensated? I laughed. Like the Rodriguez family, whose grandmother died of cancer from the contaminated water you covered up, or the Henderson children who lost their college funds when you forged their father's signature on those transfer documents. What do you want? Charles's voice was cold, calculating. Money? A position in the company? I want justice. I pulled out Helen's final letter. My aunt spent 30 years building this case, knowing she couldn't fight you directly, but she could prepare for someone who could. You destroy your own family? James demanded. Your marriage? Family? I turned to him. The moment I found evidence of murder in these files, you stopped being family. Victoria's wine glass shattered on the floor. Murder? What murder? The Henderson case wasn't just about land fraud, I said quietly. Mr. Henderson didn't die of a heart attack the night before the court hearing. Helen found the proof that Charles hired someone to make sure he never testified. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the staff had frozen in place. You're bluffing, Charles said, but his voice shook. I pulled out my phone, playing a recording. Charles's voice, 30 years younger but unmistakable, discussing payment for a permanent solution to the Henderson problem. Helen had copies of everything stored in multiple locations. I continued. If anything happens to me, it all goes public. The FBI, the media, everyone. What do you really want? Charles asked again, his empire crumbling before his eyes. I laid out a thick document on the table. Full confession, complete restitution to every family you've wronged. And Peter's development transfers control of all its properties to a community trust, which will ensure affordable housing and environmental cleanup. You'll destroy decades of business. You destroyed decades of lives. I cut him off. Sign the papers, or I start making calls. The next hour was a blur of signatures, tears, and recriminations. Victoria collapsed into her imported Italian sofa, while James alternated between begging me to reconsider and threatening legal action. But Charles knew he was beaten. Helen's evidence was too thorough, too damning to fight. By midnight, it was done. Peter's development would be transformed into a community benefit corporation. Every family they'd wronged would be compensated, and Charles Peters would face justice for Tom Henderson's death. As I left the mansion for the last time, Victoria called out weakly, "We gave you everything. Position, status, a place in society." I turned back. "No, Victoria, you gave me nothing. But Aunt Helen, she gave me something priceless. The chance to do what's right." The next few months transformed Millbrook. As the truth emerged, more victims came forward. Helen's files helped prove every case, every claim. Peter's developments, luxury developments, became affordable housing. Contaminated land was cleaned up. Families received compensation that changed their lives. James filed for divorce, of course. The society pages buzzed with speculation about the Peters family's charitable reorganization of their business empire. Only a few people knew the full truth, that a small-town lawyer had spent decades building the case that would finally bring justice to her community. I kept Helen's office exactly as it was, down to the painting hiding the safe. But now that office represents something more. Proof that sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in money, but in the power to right old wrongs. 1 year later, I sat at Helen's desk, my desk now, reviewing a new case. A young farmer was fighting a big corporation trying to seize his land through questionable means. I smiled, opening my laptop to begin research. On the wall, Helen's painting hung straight and true, hiding an empty safe. Its contents had served their purpose, but its legacy lived on in every case I took, every wrong I helped right. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by with homemade tamales, just as she used to do for Helen. "Your aunt would be proud," she said, looking around the unchanged office. "You're carrying on her real work." I thought about the letter Helen had left me, now framed on my wall. The truth isn't always where people expect to find it. She was right. Sometimes it's hidden behind paintings in small-town law offices. Sometimes it's buried in decades of careful documentation. And sometimes it's in the simple act of choosing justice over power, right over might. The Peters family had thought Aunt Helen's inheritance was worthless. They never understood that some legacies are worth more than all their mansions combined. As for me, I kept the painting, the safe, and most importantly, the promise I made the day I discovered Helen's files, to never stop fighting for justice, no matter how powerful the opposition. After all, as Helen always said, the law is meant to protect the weak from the strong, not the other way around. And in a small office in Millbrook, that principle lives on, one case at a time.